I'm Ashton Mara. I'm an assistant teaching professor here in the Reed College of Media, but tonight I am the digital managing editor of 100 Days in Appalachia, our digital news publication that's incubated here at the Media Innovation Center at the Reed College of Media. Before we begin our discussion this evening with our panelists, I'm going to ask for some help actually to introduce this project. Hallie Stockton is the managing editor of PublicSource, which is a nonprofit media outlet based in Pittsburgh. And PublicSource has really been the lead for us on this project. Hallie especially has been our editorial leader. So I'm going to ask her now to say a few words about Good River.
Hi, everyone. So Good River has been a really unique project to work on because it's unified 7 newsrooms across the watershed. So we've spanned 5 of the 15 watershed states. Much of the beginnings of this project, we were figuring out even ourselves, like, what is a watershed and how, like, who's really looking at this and what are the major issues? So it's been a learning process for us as we've gone through and talking and working with some really esteemed researchers as well as other journalists. We have published, since our November launch, almost 20 stories. And those stories range from the written word to photo essays to mini docs that I hope everyone here will explore. Soon, we're going to have, in the next 2 weeks, we'll have kind of the end stories of our first phase here. And then we're going to be taking a little bit of a pause during the spring while we'll have some camera traps out in the watershed. And what those will do is capture some footage of wildlife that's right here in our backyards, but that we don't normally see. And so hopefully we'll be able to bring you all back into the watershed experience in the late spring, early summer when that all comes about. So as a final note, I want to thank the supporters of this project. So not only the newsrooms that have produced such great work and all the journalists they've worked with, as well as the public who's been consuming it and also sharing with their students and their neighbors, but definitely our supporters of funding and also expertise, and that's been from the Lenfest Institute for Journalism and the National Geographic Society, which has been really exciting to work with them and some of their contractors. And without further ado, back to Ashton. Thank you.
Thank you, Hallie. So after our panel, we'll have some computers set up for you throughout the center to actually explore the project. One thing to note in particular is that in the front of the center, we'll have some VR headsets set up so that you can experience one of the projects that was actually created by students here in the Reed College of Media, rafting and diving and flying in a drone over the Cheat River here in West Virginia. So after we get done, make sure you stick around to experience some of those stories. So tonight, our panelists are going to take a few questions from me about their work in the Ohio River watershed, and then we're going to take some time to take questions from the audience. This, as a note for everyone, this panel is being live streamed on the 100 Days in Appalachia Facebook page, on some of our partners' Facebook pages, so when we're ready to take questions, we'll have a microphone. Please actually use the microphone. We might be able to hear you, but we'd like our audience at home to be able to hear your questions as well. I'm actually going to begin by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. And why don't we start on the end that's closest with Sarah?
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Sarah Caton. I am a project manager at the West Virginia Water Research Institute. I'm from Morgantown and previously worked for a watershed association called Friends at Eckers Creek. So hoping to offer some perspective on both the nonprofit community and my new placement at Water Research Center here at WVU.
Good evening. My name is Owen Malkeen. I'm the Associate Director at Friends of the Cheat. I'm a graduate of WVU. I went to the Davis College, graduated in 2007. I've been working with Friends of the Cheat, which is a nonprofit organization based in Kingwood in Preston County. And we've been working with the 100 Days in Appalachia Good River on a good video you guys should check out in the lobby there, the VR, but we can talk about that a little bit later, but thanks for inviting me.
Hi, everyone. Oh, mine is loud. My name is Njami Njai. I am a photographer, filmmaker, and multimedia producer based in Pittsburgh. My work documents Black experiences, contemporary Black experiences, particularly in the Pittsburgh region and more broadly in the industrial Midwest. And I contributed a story, like a photo essay, and also an interview project about Black communities along a highway called Route 65 in Western Pennsylvania.
Director of the Water Research Institute here at WVU. I've had this job with feedback or without.
You're good.
Okay, am I good? For the last 30 years, I've been working on trying to restore watersheds. We're trying to work at a large scale at the Institute and also find out the whys and wherefores and the science behind identifying which pollutants matter, which ones don't, which ones we really need to focus on because we all have limited resources and so does the taxpayer. So that's what I'm all about, and we intend to continue to find new problems and solve them one at a time. Thank you.
So Paul, my first question is actually for you. So this series covered the challenges the Ohio River watershed is facing, but it was a range of challenges from industrial pollution to aging infrastructure, the increased occurrence of flooding in many parts of the watershed due to climate change. So the West Virginia Water Research Institute does work in any number of those areas and even more that we didn't mention. So this is maybe the hardest question of the night, but what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the watershed right now?
Well, on the grand scale, the biggest one is the contradiction between a deindustrializing region, which has, if nothing else, put a lot less pollutant in the water. At the same time, the regulatory environment over the last 10 years, since the Clean Water Act went into place, has significantly improved the waters of the region. So that's gone hand in hand with deindustrialization, but at the same time, this has created poverty pockets along the river, and a lot of our communities that way up in the headwaters, southern West Virginia, rural parts, as well as the more urbanized and industrialized Mon, Allegheny, and Ohio valleys. And the result of that is that people's drinking water and also their ability to treat their sewage has gone down. So in one sense, the water's gotten better. In another sense, the exposure that people have to things like lead, also the amount of E. coli and nutrients from sewage that gets into our waters is probably as high as it has ever been. And that's largely a function of poverty, lack of a job base, lack of an economic base. So it's a contradiction. That's probably the biggest thing we have to solve right now, how to come down with a plan that actually resolves both of those factors simultaneously.
So, Owen, I think the legacy of industry has really impacted the watershed that the specific area of the watershed that you're working with. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges that the Cheat faced when Friends of the Cheat began, and how the organization has been trying to take on those challenges?
Certainly. Friends of the Cheat is about 25 years old. We started in the mid-90s, and as a result of some concerned citizens, specifically concerned with acid mine drainage in the lower Cheat, specifically from Rollsburg south down into what we know as like Cheat Lake. There was 2 significant mine blowouts in the early 90s from the TNT mine that decimated 16 miles of the Cheat Canyon all the way to Cheat Lake, huge fish kill. And it actually resulted in the Cheat being named one of the most endangered rivers by American Rivers in the early 90s. So a bunch of concerned citizens got together. The story goes they put a bunch of money. Paul can probably talk a lot about that. He was probably there in the beginning a lot of these projects, but really going after these sources and looking at the problem as a collective approach, not just a concerns watershed group trying to raise money in a jar on a fridge, but how can we get industry, how can we get government to enact change and implement projects in that in this watershed.
And what are some of the projects that you believe have been the most successful on the Cheat?
That's a good question. Like I said, acid mine drainage has been probably the biggest concern of the watershed organization, and we look at Muddy Creek as the specific case example, and Muddy Creek was the site of these blowouts in the early 90s that really kind of were the genesis and the catalyst of the movement to kind of get people involved and kind of create this this energy and these people coming together to enact change. And right now, if you go to Muddy Creek, it is completely different than it was, I would say, even 5 years ago, 20 years ago. The state has done a really good job of implementing water treatment facilities. Same with our work, implementing smaller passive treatment facilities to treat these sources. So right now, Muddy Creek has probably been the best it's ever been and has a neutral pH. We're starting to see fish return. That's all a collective effort. That's not just Friends of the Cheat. That's the state. That's the larger entities being involved. And we like to think Friends of the Cheat that we were the catalyst to kind of get that going. We lit the fires, helped get the money, raise concern for this issue, and really brought it to where it is now.
Sarah, you mentioned that you're with the Water Research Institute now, but formerly with Friends of Deckers Creek. Did the challenges that Deckers Creek faced, were they similar to what we saw on the Cheat?
Definitely. So I think, like Owen said, Friends of Cheat really laid the groundwork for smaller nonprofit watershed associations across the state to form and make an active difference. One of the biggest problems Deckers Creek has, although much smaller than the Cheat or the Mon, obviously, it runs right through Morgantown, so one of the most populated areas, exits right at Hazel Ruby McQueen Park, and acid mine drainage was definitely the biggest pollution problem we had in that watershed. We also had some E. coli problems, trash and illegal dumping all along the banks. We saw that. So when the organization started in 2000, it was just a small group of concerned citizens that wanted to clean up the trash, and they wanted to be able to recreate in the creek and see just a healthier, happier area for them to live by and along. So they worked really hard. We have 7 treatment sites now working to treat the acid mine drainage. What was a dead stream basically 20 years ago and before now has trout living in it, brown trout, some rainbows, and a variety of fish that just, it's funny when I meet some of the older people, it's like, you can't catch a fish in Deckers Creek. And I was like, actually, that's not true anymore. So it's really exciting to see that difference. And I think one of the challenges is it's kind of less known, the problems in Deckers Creek, because it's not a very recreation-based waterway as the Cheat would be. There's some very brave souls that do some kayaking. Most of us normal, sane folks would not be able to make some of those rapids down there. But it's not well known as a recreation area. But it's exciting to get to explain to people that it was an extremely polluted and problematic area running right through Morgantown, and now we're seeing huge improvements, huge leaps to clean that up and make it sustainable to fish and wildlife and macroinvertebrates, the bugs that live on the bottom. So very similar pollution problems, but kind of a nice uptick, like the Cheat, seeing a really good community form around it and trying to improve it over the years.
I want to talk a little bit more about the successes we've seen in both of those bodies of water. But Jamie, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. So your piece for this series was really focused on the experiences in communities along the Ohio River, but in essentially Rust Belt communities in the Pittsburgh area. So the issues that we face in rural areas can, especially in mining communities, can be very different than the challenges that are faced in more urban parts of the watershed. But do you see any similarities in how that pollution impacts the people specifically?
Yes. So my piece was more so focused on some of the like social and cultural and political implications of both industrialization and deindustrialization. And so I think the interesting thing about the Pittsburgh region is that you get multiple populations. You get the urban population, you get suburban, and then you also do get like that rural population. And so I started my piece in the city of Pittsburgh, which is like right, at the start of the Ohio, and then went up almost an hour north of the city. And so the things that people were saying and like the feedback I was getting and the photographs that I was taking of landscapes really kind of capture that variance. And I think initially when I conceived of the piece, I was thinking of it in terms of like environmental justice. So we know that Black and brown communities disproportionately are living in close proximity to polluting plants, are at disproportionate risk for flooding because oftentimes they were established, closest to the water and on these floodplains. And so I initially thought I was going to be asking people about that in addition to the quality of their drinking water. But as I started talking to people, when I asked them, what is your relationship to water, or what do you think about when you think of this river that you live near? Overwhelmingly, people weren't really talking about the water that they were drinking. They were talking about, going swimming in rivers as a kid, or how, this village-like community that they grew up in was very close to the river. So I knew I was thinking about drinking water, but I wanted to kind of craft the piece in a way where people could speak for themselves. And so I imagine that some people are thinking about it more than others. I imagine that people in the city, all the way up to the more rural communities, are having these conversations, especially as you go further up north, because people are sourcing their water from both groundwater and like filtered systems, but that's not really something that I got to tap into so much.
One of the conversations we had as a group of newsrooms meeting to start this project was, how do we explain to people, how do we get them to recognize that they even live in this Ohio River watershed, right? Because it's so geographically vast and diverse. I'm curious, as you were really on the ground in these communities, meeting and talking with people, did they identify in that way? Did they identify as living in this watershed, or even did they identify as being part of this community that's so dependent on their water system?
Honestly, I can't say that most of the people that I talked to did identify in that way. I think most readily people identify with the like immediate community that they lived in. So, I'm from Newcastle, or, in the city of Pittsburgh, I'm from the north side or this particular neighborhood. So people had, had very kind of like insular regional identities. I know personally I had to look up the watershed when I was first asked about this project. And because it is so vast, it was kind of like, okay, how do you take a chunk out of this? What is even a story that you could tell in a geographic region that is so kind of vast?
Paul, I'm wondering if I can put you on the spot a little bit. And Jamie mentioned that she approached this as a story about environmental justice. Can you explain that concept? What does that mean, that having access to clean drinking water or clean water to use for recreation or economic development, how is that an issue of environmental justice?
Well, that's actually a fairly easy question, because we spend a lot of our time, for example, working on cleaning up the rivers themselves. So that's what we call source water. That's the regulatory term for it. So we want to make sure that source water is good, and we knew there was more to it than that. But what we consistently find when we actually look at drinking water systems and the kind of water that's being delivered to people is almost all of the problems actually come from the water treatment and distribution system. So they're picking up fairly good water out of the river, for example, and we've done numerous studies on different pollutants this way. And for example, we were getting reports that trihalomethanes were picking up in the drinking water in the upper Mon River. So when I say upper Mon, I mean between the state line and say McKeesport. When we assumed, first of all, like a lot of people, that the halogens were coming out of the river, and that's why they were getting these high readings. Says trihalomethane is basically a methane, which is a carbon. You start attaching either chloride or bromide to it, and you get methyl bromide, right? Or methyl chloride, whatever. That's not what was going on, though. What was happening is that we were getting these readings, and all of them that were exceeding the drinking water limit, which is very low for trihalomethane. All of those were coming in the late summer, and that was when the rivers slowed down. The flows got low, and because we have a series of locks and dams, we have a series of essentially lakes all the way down the Mon and most of the Allegheny. Because of that, you had an explosion of pathogen growth in the river because all this sewage was going into the river. All these nutrients were going into the river. And so they generate a lot of methane. And so in order to make sure that the drinking water systems weren't exposing their customers to cryptosporidium or giardia, they had to over-chlorinate the water. And that's where the halogens came from. So you'd think this was a source water chloride problem, but it was just chlorination of this already slightly high methane water that was coming out of the rivers during low flow, high temperature periods of the year. So is that an environmental justice issue? Sure it is. It's the same thing as lead in your drinking water. If your service lines are lead and your treatment system doesn't have the ability or the wherewithal to add, say, the passivating agent, which is a orthophosphate. That's what they stopped doing in Flint, Michigan, for example. They stopped adding the orthophosphate, and now this water was being exposed directly to lead in the service lines from the main lines out to the houses. And it was sitting there for long enough periods of time, there was actually picking up toxic levels of lead. So yeah, is that environmental justice? Sure it is.
Owen and Sarah, I want to address this question to both of you. So both of your organizations, or your former organization, you've had success in the work that you've done, and you both touched on that. But we did, like we mentioned, the story for this project on the Cheat River, and Friends of the Cheat's executive director, Amanda Pitzer, says in the video, which I think is classic, that they did a fantastic job initially of getting the word out that there is a problem and that the waterway is polluted and we need to fix it. And here we are, we've found success, we've cleaned it, and now we have to fight our own messaging to let people know that it's safe. Can you both talk about what these organizations are doing now that you've found some success to work with and connect with the local communities and let them know that things are better?
Yeah, certainly that's a hurdle we have to overcome with that problem. Right now, we've kind of really invested in our education and outreach program, where we're doing a lot of engagement with the community. We have just hired a community development director. She's going to be working with towns along the Cheat that are associated with another project where we're building 8 miles of rail trail along the Cheat River, and that was our largest grant we received last year. It was over $3 million for a kind of an economic development, outdoor recreation, tourism kind of grant through West Virginia abandoned mine lands. So that money is going to pay for the construction of a rail trail, and also this community development aspect where we're going to send this individual into the towns, see what they want out of this project. Is it talking to local business owners about reviving their business to kind of support this rail trail and other tourism that the river offers. Another component is that we have a snorkel program where we sign up young students to go out and snorkel in the river and kind of just appreciate what's below the surface, and we provide that as kind of as a free activity to elementary age students. I mean, we have a Cheat River Festival the first weekend of May, which is a huge outreach event for us, our largest fundraiser. You know, we reach over 4,000 people with that event alone. I mean, we have a lot of components where we're out just spreading this message that, like, you know, the river's cleaned up. We need people to come back and, you know, enjoy the recreation opportunities, the rafting, the snorkeling, you know, the kayaking, the fishing. That's all there. And I think other people need to join in that, you know, the state needs to be involved. You know, we're a nonprofit entity sharing that message, but I think there's other people that can help share that message and support kind of that greater effort that's going on in West Virginia.
Sarah, has Deckers Creek had success in sharing that message?
I think so. We have a pretty active community following. We follow similar lines, like Owen said, with Friends of Cheat as well. We do massive education and outreach programs. We've worked with schools all across Mon County and Preston County to teach the kids about the pollution they saw, how it's possible to clean it up, and you know, steps they can take towards helping in the future. We also host a variety of fun events and education, trying to put those together. We have a little Arts in the Park series, trying to combine, you know, for people that maybe aren't into the nitty-gritty science of it all, they can come out. We have a park along the Deckers Creek and the rail trail there, where they can come out and do activities that combine the two. We also, for our fundraisers, I don't like to think of them as just, you know, give us your money, we're having a fun event. We also try to use that opportunity to put on a fun event, to bring people in and talk to them about what's going on in the watershed, what they can do to help, what needs to be done to continue the work. We have been, I think, extremely successful in our cleanup at Deckers Creek, but it has a long way to go. The biggest polluter is the Richard Mine, and it's just a couple miles upstream of Morgantown, and it still puts out over 200,000 pounds of pollutants in the water a year. So we have a lot of continuing to work to do. So we try to also stress that. We want to show the good and all the good that the treatment has done to improve upon Deckers Creek. And we are seeing those trout and we are seeing those fish return, and we push that and we push that. We also have to remember to let people know that there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot to be done there. And a combination of, hey, it's getting better, get out to these really clean spots that are seeing improvement, go fishing, bring your friends on the rail trail, but also remember that we still need the support to continue that mission and to continue to clean up those AMD sources, the acid mine drainage sources, and other pollutants, and even trash and litter. We just see so much of that we have cleanup events all the time. It brings people out in the community, it gets them out there, and gets them thinking about it and helping to beautify where they live and feel better about where they are and how they utilize their watershed.
So I've got one more question for our panelists, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions if you guys want to be thinking about the things that you have to ask. So, and Jamie, this one is going to be for you. So the lasting legacy of knowing that your water is polluted, I think, is very relevant to what happened on the Cheat, what happened on Deckers Creek. But whether that's short-term and long-term, it was also the inspiration for a story that 100 Days contributed to this project about C8, which is a chemical that's used to make Teflon that was dumped into the water in the Parkersburg, West Virginia area, and that chemical never goes away. It's a forever chemical. It will always be in that water system. It will always be in people's bodies. In your piece, you say, I drink water from a filtered pitcher because of years of elevated lead levels in Pittsburgh's water, and I regularly learn about new water threats in the region. I feel a constant push and pull between the things that are good for me and the things that can harm me. So I'm wondering, in your personal experience, in your experience in reporting this story in these Ohio River communities, how do they feel about the water that they have access to? Has that pollution eroded their trust? Is that a lasting impact?
Yeah, I think it's tough because it's like, even if you know something, even if you know there's a problem, it's sometimes hard to feel like you can do anything about it. So I know when I started researching this project, I was going down a rabbit hole, and I started looking at like the lead line maps in the city of Pittsburgh, because they're doing a lot of lead line replacements because there have been elevated levels for so long. And I look at my parents' street, the house that I grew up in, and every house like on our street, except for like my parents and our like immediate neighbors, all those houses were good, and for some reason we still had lead lines. And it's like my mom, they had sent kits to the house, and she had, done the test and sent them out. And it was just a little bit sobering, because it's like, it's so easy to look at these issues as over there, but then it's like literally sitting here on my computer screen. It's like right here. It's very personal. And so, I think sometimes there's desensitization. I think sometimes there's like, well, I know this is going on, but I'm 75 years old and it hasn't killed me yet. And there's some of, it's like, well, this is a problem and I don't like it, but what can I do about it? Where can I go? So I guess it's, it's open-ended. I think that there are people who are kind of pushing back and raising awareness, but it's tough because it's like people are still like living their everyday lives. So that advocacy piece, that activism piece, it's like a few folks speaking for many, which is how it typically goes, but hopefully more can be done to draw more attention to those few and amplify their voices, because it does impact us all.
Okay, do we have any questions out here? You'll raise your hand. Right here, Kristen.
Hi. We live in a day and age where people question what comes from scientists and journalists. So as both scientists and journalists, how do you guys think that combining your efforts together affected this project?
Go ahead, Owen.
Sure. The Good River and the 100 Days in Appalachia, they came to the Cheat River and they made this video that kind of highlighted the things that we wanted to talk about and share the good message. Like Ashton's question to me earlier about like, we've been dealing with this message of that it's bad, it's polluted, we need to enact change. How do we do that? Where's the money? Who's going to do that? And we've kind of solved that issue in the beginning. We're at this point now where we're flipping the page and we're on a new chapter. And I think this video right here kind of, hopefully you get to go outside and see it with the virtual reality 360 video, kind of just highlights the things that we wanted to show, that there is clean water, that there's abundant activities that you can be involved in, that there is, clean drinking water, and the majority of this watershed, it's messaging, and we were really fortunate to be able to connect with this group and work with students and kind of share that message through a kind of a unique platform. There's only so many articles you can read on the internet, and looking at text can be kind of a little bit boring sometimes. So I think this video was a kind of a unique way to kind of share the message with a unique perspective.
Paul, go ahead.
Can I have a shot at that one? This isn't the first time I've said this, but in order to fix big environmental problems, you need three things. You need technology, you need public will, and you need money. And we can sit around in the universities all we want and generate brilliant technologies, but if we haven't convinced the policymakers or the public that it's worth the investment of money to actually believe that we have a solution and to invest in our solution and invest in their own watersheds, then well, it's kind of a pointless exercise. So to me, connecting with the press, connecting with journalists is extremely important to get that message across. Otherwise, we're sitting in isolation.
Other questions?
I noticed one of the communities featured in the photo roundup on the screen was in Mingo County, West Virginia, right there. And so I wonder, like, for the advocates who have worked to improve water quality in places like here in Morgantown or in Mon County, what sorts of lessons could you share with people in southern West Virginia who live in much more isolated communities and are having a hard time drumming up interest in fixing their own broken systems?
That's a really good question, and the Cheat River watershed is a very large watershed. It extends all the way up to Shavers Fork in the Cheat Mountain in Pocahontas County, and goes all the way to Mon County and into PA. So there's a wide range of economic, socioeconomic factors from there all the way down here. And where I work is in rural Preston County, and we have that same issue of people, not understanding water quality issues, and taking the time to educate them is a daily task. If it's in the gas station and you're talking to Bill about his weekend and he asks, well, what's going on up on Muddy Creek? I heard they're putting in a sewage treatment plant, and it takes time out of my day to educate this person, like, no, that's not a sewage treatment plant, that's actually a water treatment plant fixing the water quality from all these mines that have been existing for hundreds of years or 80 years, and kind of just having that reaction or that connection on the human level, with the personal, talking to them as they were your neighbor. It's tough to go out and just speak in your ivory tower or your non-profit organization platform telling everybody what the problem is, but I think it just takes boots on the ground engagement and really you need the beat on the street. You need to go out, you need to be invested in your community, you need to go to the spaghetti dinners, you need to be in contact with these people, and that's a tough thing to do. It takes a lot of energy. People don't always want to listen to you. They think you're there to fix their problem, and maybe they like what they're doing. So it's tough, and I think how we've been successful is just time in the game. 25 years this organization's been around. Our message is finally breaking through, and people, there's a lot of nationwide things that surrounded water quality, and people are smart. Just got to give them the opportunity to listen to what you have to say, and like I said, just talking to them like they're your friend, they're your neighbor.
If I can just add a little bit to that, I think also connecting with them about what's important for them. So if you're talking, I know in my experience, talking to someone that can say, well, I've been swimming in this creek or river for whatever year and I'm fine. And they're, 70 years old, and they don't necessarily think about their health in that way. But if you can connect it back to something that's important to them, their children, their grandchildren, or even their love of the outdoors, they might not, off the top of their head, think of themselves as environmentalists, but a lot of times I connect with people about fishing or hunting, and they love to be outside, and they love to see these waterways improve. So I think kind of framing it that way to what's important, because cleaning up pollution can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, depending on where you live, how you live, your age, your anything. So kind of connecting them with what's important to them and what's important to you, and kind of realizing the common ground there, and finding that.
I think we've got time for one more. Anybody out there?
Sorry, it takes me a second. There you go.
Hey, thanks for coming out and doing this. It's awesome. I was just wondering if there has been, I guess I don't know as much about the Ohio River Basin. I live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but in quantifying the change in health of the rivers that you guys work in terms of, we're talking about a little bit about water quality and a little bit about the social and economic impacts of having healthy water. Has there been any efforts to sort of put a grade or put an amount of change in the health of the rivers that you guys work in? And if so, where could I find that?
Well, we have a program that's funded by Colcom Foundation, a group out of Pittsburgh, that has been monitoring the three rivers since 2009. So we have a record. We have something like 114 sampling stations, It's online. It's under 3RQ. If you look that up, you can actually look at your particular river and get the long-term trends at any particular station. So what we've been able to identify is that, well, here's a good example. Back in 2008, we started getting reports that the total dissolved solids was going up in the Mon River to the point where it was exceeding secondary drinking water standards for TDS, total dissolved solids, and sulfate. And we were able to pull together enough money to actually do a survey for about a 6-month period and identify chemically what the pollutants were, what the constituents of the TDS were. We found that it was treated acid mine drainage from mine pumping operations. So they were treating their water to meet Clean Water Act discharge limits, but they did not include things like sulfate, bicarbonate, calcium, sodium, all right? Things that won't kill you, but they can cause a municipal water treatment system to actually have to start warning their customers about drinking bottled water because they're exceeding the drinking water limits secondary. So to get back to your question again, so it's nice to be able to monitor and look at the long-term trends, but the other thing is to be able to do something about it. So we're able to actually take this data, this monitoring data, and talk to the people who were operating these treatment plants and we put together a flow-based model that said, listen, folks, if you simply back off pumping during the critical part, the dry part of the year, when we were getting all these TDS exceedances, we can keep in compliance. And they said, the coal industry said, sure, we can do that. Didn't cost much money. And they did. And there hasn't been an exceedance of TDS or sulfate ever since. And the Mon had been listed as impaired for sulfate back in 2010, and it got off that list 5 years later after 5 years of monitoring. And another thing about when you're working on cleaning up watersheds, you can't fake it. I mean, if you say you've fixed the water and someone else goes out and samples the river the next day and finds that you didn't fix the water, well, there's your credibility shot right there. So these are all verifiable kinds of procedures. People can go right to our same monitoring points, sample, and verify whether we're right or not. So to answer your question, it's not enough just to monitor and track the improvements, which is important, but when you see a problem, to be able to do something about it.
I think that's all the time we have for questions, but if you all will join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all. And we want to thank all of you for coming out to join us tonight. We also want to thank the sponsors of the series, Good River Stories of the Ohio, the National Geographic Society, Lenfest, and the William Penn Foundation, and of course, all of the journalists and editors who have worked so hard on this project. So I want to encourage you all to hang out for a little bit longer. We have some computers set up at the back tables so you can explore the stories. Again, we keep pushing it, but that video is really cool. So hang out. Try the 360. We have the headsets and all the stuff. Our students who worked on the project will be out there to talk to you about that experience as well. Students, if you are here for extra credit, your sign-out sheet is at the front desk. But if you are in my class, you had extra work to do, so I will get that handed to me before you leave. So again, thank you all so much for being here this evening.